Disclaimer. This video is not an examination of every claim of wokeness or bigotry found in video games. It is a look at the attitudes around politics and agendas in games, boycotts, and how I believe these subjects should be approached. For every game I mention and potentially defend, there are dozens other that I would not do the same for. I am using specific examples to make a broader point. If you understand this, you will likely find this video to be much more reasonable.
Let's see here. I love the new Fable design and Western developer aesthetics, Western devs, Eastern devs, targeted harassment, no racism, sexism, or what the hate based on identity of bro, who the fuck is reporting this shit? Hate based on identity. Bro, you call somebody ugly, that's not an identity, that's just a fact. Guys, why is there 1,000 comments about this? Like, I don't understand how mind-broken people are that they can't understand the idea that people want to play a character that's hot. And especially if it's a chick. Like, what the fuck are we talking about? I know ugly people exist. I've been to Walmart. And you know what else? I've also looked in the mirror. That's the last thing I want to think about. What the fuck is this?
Those that don't know anything about these, fear not, they're video games. I'll give a general idea of what they are, but they are both introducing wokeness in their character creation models. A Trojan horse, as it were, for ideas that don't make sense, shouldn't exist, confuse young people, and oh boy, the leftists are getting really mad about this.
To the anti-woke creepers, chill out, leave trans people alone, and get used to games, including them, because you're losing this one. Losers, winners, triggered, not triggered, out group, in group.
Shut up, you stupid bitch!
And you know, I love nothing more than f***ing gender ambiguity! F***ing pronouns!
Pronouns, or trying to abolish pronouns in and of itself, is a way to try to terrorize the English language, specifically because of how fucking brain broken you are about trans people existing.
We're so f***ing boring! Sorry, did you want to get immersed in our world? Yeah, well, guess what? F*** off!
Everything is sexist, everything is racist, everything is homophobic, and you have to point it all out.
You take everything we love, all our emotions, all our fantasies, all our escapism, and you just can't help shovel your dog shit, fucking crap ideology into everything, every single solitary fucking thing.
That's gonna be a fucking yikes from me. Holy shit.
Game developers need to continue actively working towards creating the same range and diversity of female body representations that we see among male characters.
I'm making a game just like everyone else, so why wouldn't you take me seriously? Like, is it because I'm black? I mean, it probably is.
Yeah, you suck. You just fucking suck.
Boy, that escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
It jumped up a notch.
It did, didn't it?
It sure did, Mr. Burgundy. The discussion around Sweet Baby Inc., DEI, and forced inclusion is a dumpster fire of a debate. There are folks on both sides screaming at each other and lobbing all manner of names and isms to denigrate their opponents. It seems that the window for rational discussion has shrunk more and more with each passing day. You're either a woke scold, screaming for all white people to be erased from games and media, or the mere inclusion of a person of color or minority designates a game as a piece of propaganda trash that must be boycotted. The studios that develop games find themselves in an extraordinarily precarious position, in which the inclusion of anything that could be remotely construed as progressive immediately attracts the snarling indignation of anti-woke fanatics, but towing an entirely neutral line throughout the experience brings on their heads the wrath of the hyper-progressive mob who scream that a lack of inclusion and diversity is in and of itself Hitlerian racism manifested in the modern day. Inevitably, boycotts occur over stupid and trivial things. The gender-neutral bathrooms in the Dead Space remake became a reason to not buy the game, even though gender-neutral bathrooms are the most commonly used type of restrooms in commercial and industrial settings like the Ishimura. Hogwarts Legacy is boycotted because its sales would drop a mere dozen pennies into the millions already profited by an author who has spoken milquetoast comments regarding transgender people, a group of people that's represented in the game itself. There are a number of ways a studio can approach backlash. It can pretend it isn't happening, as is the current case with Helldivers 2 and the small group of people screaming that they need gay pride flags or capes in the game. Secondarily, the creators could issue a rushed and fervent apology and patch in or out the problematic or missing content, such as Ubisoft did when a small minority of people lost their minds over the description of a woman's burned face as disfigured. Third, or finally, they could double down and stick with their original vision for the product. No apologies or changes needed, as was the case with Kingdom Come Deliverance. Every one of these responses nets anger from one crowd or another, but money talks, and in a turbulent development environment like today's, a studio is likely to go with the option they think will affect their bottom line the least. So how do we make sense of all this? In order to unravel this rat's nest of vitriol and division, I think it's useful to examine some of the studios who have come under scrutiny, their responses, and how it has affected them in the long term. We will start with the aforementioned Kingdom Come Deliverance. Kingdom Come Deliverance was released on February 13, 2018. It was met with generally positive reviews and sits at an 8.1 user score on Metacritic. For all intents and purposes, most people seem to love the game, but not everyone. A review by Robert Perchesi, or Perchess, for Eurogamer.net had some interesting things to say about the game shortly after its release. Robert states, "There's also a big problem. There are no people of color in the game beyond people from the Kuman tribe, a Turkic people from the Eurasian steppe. The question is, should there be? The game's makers say they've done years of research and found no conclusive proof there should be. But a historian I spoke to, who specializes in the area, disagrees." The author goes on to explain how the historian that he talked to suggested that some black people could have traveled through the area that the game is set in, and theorized that there might have been illegitimate children conceived by those of other descent when staying inside inns. In a statement, the studio's co-founder said, "Now comes the argument of the critics. But what about black people? After more than 4 years of intensive research, it can be stated that there is no proof that there were no dark-skinned people in Bohemia, and vice versa. There are many things that we cannot prove. Otherwise, we would have to assume, for example, that lions would have lived in the forests of Bohemia. After all, the coat of arms of the ruling house is adorned with a lion. Where else could people have had this portrait?" This statement seems to be suggesting that in the event of a lack of conclusive evidence, the developers preferred to err on the side of caution. The forum site Reset Era is rife with conversations of people boycotting the game and losing their mind over the fact that the product doesn't have what they view to be proper representation. In one comical post, a user actually states that they did a brief Google search and were able to debunk the stances of the developers who worked with various experts for years in the production of their game. At the end of the day, the developers ultimately flipped the bird to the gaming press and the pants-pissing mob who cried racism. The studio head stuck to their guns and no forced diversity was implemented. The game has sold over 6 million copies, and a sequel is in the works. Example number 2 is Resident Evil 4 Remake. RE4 doesn't need a lengthy introduction, it is simply one of the most highly regarded survival horror games of all time, and to many, one of the greatest games ever created. The remake, which released on March 23, 2023, was loved by nearly everyone who played it, but because Twitter is a place that exists, it still managed to find controversy. In the original RE4, Ashley, one of the main characters of the game, wore a dress which didn't do the best job of covering her when she climbed up ladders. This caused many a thirsty, sweaty gamer to take peeps where they probably should not. Leon, the protagonist, also exchanged a number of flirty dialogue lines between him, his dispatcher Hunnigan, and another woman named Ada. All of this was removed in the remake for the purposes of sensitivity. To the best of my knowledge, nobody of any consequence has issued a statement about the cut content. There was backlash, and people pissed and moaned about their inability to look up skirts or rizz up women, but guess what? Resident Evil 4 Remake became the second fastest selling Resident Evil game to date, topping 4 million units sold in 2 weeks, and now resting somewhere in the 7 million sales range. A pattern is beginning to emerge, so let's look at a third example. Stellar Blade is the newest game on the list. It was released a few weeks ago on April 26, 2024. The run-up to the game's release was rife with controversy, however. The age-old subjects of female sexualization, objectification, fan service, jiggle physics, beauty standards, and realism were debated among sweaty gamers from every side of the political mosh pit. You see, the main protagonist of the game, Eve, is quite a looker. A full dish, one might say. In addition, the creatives at the top wanted to make sure that you, as the player, could get very familiar with her character model if you so desired. Skimpy outfits abound in Stellar Blade, and Eve can battle many monstrous creatures in various forms of undress. At one point, articles were circulating that a few employees with more feminist inclinations were let go from Shift Up, the dev studio, due to their objections over the game's content. The game raised so many eyebrows that a not insignificant number of people believed it would be censored in some way leading up to its launch. But the official X account of the developer posted that the same game would be shipped uncensored across the world. This caused many gamers to flock around the title as a middle finger to the woke establishment of gaming. Launch day came, and the game released, but something seemed different to the keen observers. The holiday rabbit suit, which was more or less a very low-cut V-neck, one-piece bodysuit, had been altered from the 1.0 version. A breathy cry of anguish rose from the loins of every true gamer as they realized that the V-taper of the dress, in the back, had been lowered to better cover Eve's almost entirely exposed pre-patch buttocks, and a lacy bra had been implemented to cut down on some of the excessive cleavage. Further, for no apparent reason, the gore effects that would leave the skimpy protagonist covered in viscera was toned down so that she would stay more or less clean in combat. These are odd changes to say the least. The holiday rabbit didn't appear to be the most egregious display of sexuality, and the gore was still very present everywhere else, just not in the character herself. In spite of how odd these alterations were, many still lost their minds. Threats of boycotts were hurled as disgruntled players felt they had been got by a developer folding on their word. There is a totally fair argument to be made that this is exactly what happened. Consumers were promised one thing, then seemingly given another, though I would reiterate that censorship still feels like a weird word to use when referencing the alteration of a suit that wasn't even the greatest offender of potentially objectionable fan service. Though exact sales numbers are difficult to come across due to the game's novelty, the dubious Twitter account ZubiTech suggested that with the launch performance, the game was likely to hit 1 million units sold in 24 hours, an extremely respectable performance for a new game from a relatively unknown studio. Stellar Blade currently sits at a very high 9.3 user score on Metacritic, in spite of the backlash from both sides. So, these are some interesting and cool examples of games that triggered the masses, but what do we learn from them? Well, the first thing to notice is the thing that I made a note of with every game that I discussed. Kingdom Come Deliverance pissed off the woke crowd, gained recognition, high ratings, and sold like gangbusters. Resident Evil 4 Remake pissed off the anti-woke crowd, gained recognition as a phenomenal remake, accrued exceedingly high ratings, and sold incredibly well. Stellar Blade pissed off everyone it could, the screaming woke scolds and the mauling anti-woke warriors. Then it went on to capitalize off its controversy with recognition, high reviews, and fantastic opening sales. In spite of who these games pissed off or how the developers saw fit to respond, the quality of the games themselves seemed to be the ultimate deciding factor in how they performed. The Suicide Squad game that released a few months back was panned for many reasons, the suggestion that Sweet Baby Inc.'s involvement caused woke themes to be injected being among them. However, nobody in their right mind believes that the abject failure of the Suicide Squad was because of a Twinkie Joker or SBI's involvement. The game's failure was due to it being a steaming pile of manure that nobody wanted to play. It wasn't fun. The reality is, when we scroll Twitter or X, we see 36 people spouting off about how they will never support a game or company again. And it's easy to believe that there's a large movement taking place in which a game or entity will be punished for some perceived wrongdoing, but we have to remember that those 36 people are only 36 people. Further, internet people are not to be taken seriously. They talk big on the internet, but will gladly do the exact opposite of what they say because they know the other internet people will likely be none the wiser. So, not only are these people a vocal minority, but they are a vocal minority with no follow-through. Let's be honest, how many people who were pissed about the changes to Resident Evil 4 actually refused to buy the game? By sales numbers, they were very few and far between. Summarizing this, outrage, boycotts, and Twitter screeds against games are generally orchestrated by small groups of radicals with strong opinions, weak convictions, and loud voices. But how do we know if we are the radicals? How radical is too radical, and on what projects should our principled boycotts be placed? To get into these questions, I want to look at another game, Hades 2. Hades 2 has already found itself in controversy. It released into early access a few days ago, and it has become a critical darling for nearly everyone experiencing it. In spite of early impressions, there are those claiming that they will be choosing to forego a purchase of the game on principled anti-progressive agenda grounds. These grounds are based upon a few key factors. 1. The suggestion that some characters and gods have been race-swapped for diversity's sake. 2. The presence of gay themes. And 3, for some particularly stringent boycotters, the suggestion that a female protagonist is in and of itself forced inclusion. I am not interested in disputing what should or shouldn't be present in this game. There are plenty of arguments to be had about the Greeks' skin color, their sexual proclivities, and the existence of female protagonists. To the best of my knowledge and everyone else who has played the early access, these inclusions are the extent of the perceived wokeness. Having established that, let's take a quick side quest here. There's a very fine line between the inclusion of diverse characters and the legitimate pushing of an agenda. It should not have to be stated that a game with black characters isn't automatically a woke game. A game with black characters who spout slanderous dialogue against white people or any other perceived oppressor class likely is. In the latter case, this is blatant preaching of an agenda and viewpoint. It's a game created with the express purpose of spreading a message. The idea that someone would not want to engage with a game or product that blatantly degrades them makes perfect sense. A fairly recent example is the game Validate, a visual novel dating simulation created by a small team and led by a woman named Dani Lalonders. Here are Dani's feelings on white people.
Who is your team? A little background about this. I have a team of 21 right now for Validate. It's a pretty big team. It's a crazy big team for indie games. But who is your team? Validate has a team of mostly all people of color. We have no white people on our team. I did that because I wanted to create a safe environment. And I know the best way for an environment to be safe is to be around people who are just like me. And I'm not saying that white people in the industry are creating unsafe environments. I'm not saying that. That is not what I'm saying. I am saying that sometimes it is hard to work with white people because they think that something may be okay, but it was really a microaggression. And no one wants to deal with that while they're trying to make a game that they love.
It doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand this woman is racist. The game she and her team created intentionally excluded white people, and most of the characters are somewhere along the LGBTQ spectrum, and modeled like the 12 magical fairy freaks from the infamous Snow White remake photo. More than the cast of the game itself, the team she assembled to create it actively precluded any white people from working with them. The team and the game both preach a blatant agenda, exclude only white people and characters. It turns out, the game isn't very good and it sits at a soft mixed on Steam, but that's neither here nor there. This game is an example of an experience in which a principled boycott would make sense from one side of the political aisle. Ending our side quest and looping back around to Hades 2, there have been no such reports of exclusion or intentional racism from Supergiant Games or their project leads. And besides that, they have created what is ostensibly one of the best games to release this year. It's fast-paced, deeply engrossing, well-written, and if the first Hades is any indication, will likely end up on many people's Game of the Year list. It's a game of spectacular quality. It is a game created by passionate people who care for the project they are making and want to deliver the best product they possibly can to their consumers. They are not preaching an ideology, they are designing a truly top-shelf game, and there are black characters in it. These things are subject to change, of course. Perhaps in the final release of the game, there will be a reverse KKK that string up all the white-skinned Greeks and scream, "Down with the patriarchy," but that is yet to be seen. Now don't get me wrong, I understand the frustration with race swapping of characters. It's unnecessary, forced, and stupid nearly all of the time. I'm not suggesting that changes like these do not matter at all. They do, and they are indicative of a changing market and game developers' desires to stay in the good graces of a dying journalist class that becomes more unhinged with every weakened breath that takes them closer to the end of their abysmal careers on pitiful websites. I'm suggesting that maybe the merits of the game outweigh the objectionable content, and perhaps the gaming landscape is far better off with a developer like Supergiant Games putting out experiences like Hades 2 that may be tinged in a woke lens, as opposed to a gaming landscape where boycotts potentially destroy good studios and leave paragons of mediocrity like Ubisoft to pump out their next lazy open world slopfest that may suck, but has no gender-neutral bathrooms. There's one more thing I'd like to talk about briefly in this video. On April 23, Tales of Kenzera Zhao was released on a number of platforms. The first issue many had with the game was the involvement that Sweet Baby Inc. had in its development. Though their actual role is not clear, for those deciding to make a principled stand against all SBI-influenced games, I understand and will not argue against it. It is your choice as a consumer at the end of the day. The second, though small contingent of people, is the one I want to mention. These are the people who were upset at the game by the mere fact that it was solely focused on a black protagonist. Though the thought process was likely SBI plus black character equals woke propaganda, this is the kind of knee-jerk insanity that I want to briefly discuss. The creator of the game is black and wanted to create an experience pulled from his Zimbabwean culture, and drawing on the widely human experiences of loss, grief, and emotional pain. This story was directly inspired by the death of the creator's father. It isn't woke or anti-white propaganda, it's just storytelling. So this raises the question, can creators even put people of other races in their games without immediate backlash from an anti-woke crowd? Well, yeah, they obviously can, as evidenced by more games than I care to list, but it does seem that there's a contingent of people who just don't understand the difference between actual forced diversity of race or gender and the desire of a creator to simply create something from the ground up with diversity included. I think discourse would be a lot healthier if people were able to draw these distinctions on their own. At the end of the day, I want good games. I think most of us do. And it seems odd that we can read a 6 out of 10 review and still pull the trigger on the purchase of a game that we know has some lackluster mechanics or an underdeveloped story, yet at the mere presence of a race-swapped character or a lack of any diverse characters of one's own personal choosing, we might entirely skip a 9 or 10 out of 10 game. I think we would be much better off with the 9s and 10 out of 10s than a world with nothing but 6s. We aren't in a world where boycotts work, with rare exceptions, but the industry is becoming increasingly more volatile, and if someday a gem of a studio like Supergiant Games were to be lost due to boycotts, while EA continued to put out recycled, microtransaction-riddled sports game garbage, I would be saddened by that. But what do you think? I opened this video talking about a discussion, and I am genuinely interested in having one. What am I missing here? Am I too soft on wokeness in video games? Have my spine and my scruples evaporated into a fine mist and been lost in the sea of SBI influence? Let me know. I'm curious. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are watching this or listening to this, that means one of two things. One, you skipped to the end of the video, which is kinda weird. Or two, you watched the whole thing, in which case, dude, thanks. That's pretty poggers of you. This is normally where I'd read a Raid Shadow Legends sponsorship or World of Tanks, but I don't have one of those, so instead I'll just say, hey, maybe go listen to our podcast, Deep Fried Gaming. It's on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, all the big podcast platforms. It's hosted by myself and my friend RJ. We just talk games and game news, reviews, roasts, retrospectives, the like. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.